Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here this hot day. Thank you, Rachel, and the library for hosting here, and thank you, John, and the local TV for filming it. So I'm going to start with the talk, maybe half an hour, and then go to Q&A. If you have an urgent question, please feel free to cut me, just ask something. If there is something unclear, that's something I said. I want to talk about the US challenges in the Middle East, mostly following the recent war in the Middle East. I'm going to start with a short background, not going all the way to World War II, but mostly to the 70s, because that kind of the turning point that led us to this current war. The United States has been involved in the Middle East, of course, over the years. Since World War II, there was more interest because of the oil that was found here. And after that, during the Cold War, the Middle East, we see here, was split between states that were pro-Americans or pro-Soviets. It's part of fighting for influence in the Middle East. So there were changes over the years, like here, there is Israel that was associated with the United States. Mostly since the late 60s, there was Syria and Egypt that were associated with the Soviet Union, and Iran that was much more close to the West until 1979. And other states were kind of sometimes in the middle, sometimes more with the Soviet Union, it depends. So there was the 1967 war, as we all know, when between Israel, Syria, and Egypt. And then again, 1973 war between Israel and Syria and Egypt and other Arab states. That was the peak of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Iran was completely out of it, of this conflict. They didn't support, let alone participate in any of the battles. Actually, since the 60s, Iran and Israel had pretty good relations, even on the military level. They didn't run a joint exercise, but Israel sold them all kinds of goods and got in return oil from Iran. All that changed in 1979. That is a very crucial year, because in 1979 there was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, as we all know, because of the hostages, the American hostages that were there for almost a year. And that started also the conflict between Iran and the United States, and Iran and Israel, and it's all mixed together. At the same time, it's worth to mention that here in Egypt, there was the peace process, and then that led to the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. So Egypt, that until then was more or less on the other side, as far as the United States is concerned, became a US ally. Since then, Egypt receives from the United States every year $1.3 billion. Israel receives much more. Israel gets $3.8 billion every year. But it's not exactly in money, it's more like in ability to buy, get for free American weapon system and maintenance and other things. I can talk more about any of those subjects later on. In Iran, they had, for example, American weapon systems like the F-14. Some of us remember it from, if you remember, Top Gun and all that movies. So it was there. They had a lot of American weapon system. And since then, they are still kind of flying, even today. The Iranians, although after 1979, the US cut, of course, all the aid to Iran, but they managed in Iran to improvise somehow and make those planes fly. They are not very effective sometimes, but they can fly. In the recent war, for example, they had no impact. There was no air-to-air combat that we know about. So that's more or less the background. For the United States, our main interest in the Middle East, of course, is the oil from Saudi Arabia and other Arab states here in the Gulf. That's why right now there are like 46,000 American troops here around Iran. That was the peak. Before the crisis and the war, there were less of them. The US has bases here in Bahrain. That's where the base of the US Fifth Fleet. And here in Qatar, the large air base. The US invested billions of dollars in that base in order to have their very long runways that were basically almost every US plane can land, or including every bomber, just in case. Of course, it's always problematic for the United States to use bases. They have also bases in Saudi Arabia, to use them as part of their activities against Iran, because those Arab states are very concerned about Iran. Can also talk about more of that later on if you want to, because many sometimes associate, they think because Iran and the Arabs are Muslims, they are the same. No, there are a lot of differences between them. Iran is not Arab, they are Arabs, so there are ethnic differences. Iran is mostly Shiites. In Islam, they have the Shiites and the Sunnis, and the Arabs are, almost all of them are Sunnis. And of course, there are differences between interests between states, and some of those conflicts go back like more than 1,000 years, even before many of those states were even established. So that's more or less the conflict, the nature of the conflict so far. There's a conflict between Iran and Israel since 1979, and there is more a quiet conflict, you can say, where a lot of tension between Iran and Arab states, and especially Saudi Arabia. Like in 2019, Iran launched an attack against Saudi Arabia oil facilities, and the United States didn't respond. That was a major blow for Saudi Arabia that always relied on the United States to protect her. There are very complicated and sometimes problematic relations between Saudi Arabia and the United States, going back to the beginning, because of course Saudi Arabia is not really a democracy, and there are violations of human rights there and so on. But because of the oil and other interests, the United States want Saudi Arabia on their side, especially now the Trump administration. You know, before the war, he went there and signed the deals, including arms deals, worth hundreds of millions of dollars to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, and also to here it's like this state, United Arab Emirates, also an important state in the Gulf. It's worth mentioning that that state managed also to develop itself and gain money and a reputation as part to do business. It's a very important business center. So they not only rely on oil and gas like other Arab states, but in other areas. Saudi Arabia, under their young leader, is not the official leader, is only the crown prince, because the king, his father, is still alive, but he basically runs the show. His name is Ben Salman, Mohammed Ben Salman, MBS as they like to call him for short. And he has a vision for Saudi Arabia, Vision 2030. He wants to make Saudi Arabia rely less on income from oil and other ways to make money, like tourism. Is building kind of in the north there, kind of a high-tech, super modern city. It's a very ambitious project, something really like looks from out of a movie. We'll see it, it's not yet clear if it succeeds. And what else? There is this, of course, Iraq. You know Iraq from the war that happened there in 2003, and after that, all the war that the US was involved there until they gradually took their forces out of there. Iraq now is a very fragile state that suffers from corruption. Although they have a lot of oil, they have problems to use it to the benefit of the population because of corruption and power struggles between the different factions there and the parties. They have elections, but you cannot really call it a democracy right now. And they are still trying to, for example, there is a strong Iranian influence in Iraq, all over, like on politics, economy, society, you name it. So some of them try to push the Iranians out, and others want to collaborate with the Iranians. So that's part of the complexity of the entire region, because Iran has ambitions to be the most dominant power in the region. The recent war was a major setback for Iran, but still they didn't give it up, at least not for now. Iran used to be an empire, and they saw that ruled their territory, not the current Iran, Persia, as we all know. Iran is relatively a new name. They were in charge of much bigger territory, so they don't want to conquer the Middle East, they just want to be the dominant power there. Other states, Syria. Syria was under the rule of the Assad regime since 1970 until 2024. There was a major civil war there. More than 500,000 people were killed. Many states were involved in that civil war. A year ago, the regime there was toppled by the rebels that are associated with Al-Qaeda. So it's like the enemy fighting, for many it was the one enemy fighting their other enemy, but they managed to bring down the Assad regime, and he himself escaped to Russia. Now they have a new leader who's a former ISIS official leader, but he kind of reformed, at least he presented himself as someone who reformed. Trump met him 2 months ago. And there are chances that he might be, there are still nobody is really sure if he's a moderate or just try to pretend he's a moderate and how much you can do business with it. And Syria is still, it's like in ruins. Even before the war, their economy was not doing so good. And now it's like in shambles. The US has some presence in Syria, hundreds of troops. There used to be more, but Trump wants to take all of them out. So that's not a state that it's very important to the United States. The US is focused here on the Gulf and also a little bit here on the Gaza Strip and other areas. I can talk about the Gaza Strip separately later if you want to. And this is more or less very general background to the current war. Again, if you want, I can talk about other subjects, but I guess because this is the hot topic, I can talk about that a little bit more now. I will not talk about political aspects or something like that. My expertise is mostly military affairs. I can say that this war that lasted 12 days started when Israel launched an attack on Iran, mostly because Iran has an advanced nuclear program, and Israel assumed that Iran is about to produce nuclear weapons. So still, there is, people argue how much Iran was close to have it, but Israel did not want to take any more chances, so they attacked. And of course, after that, the United States joined them, but only for one strike. It is important to remember that it wasn't like an ongoing campaign by the United States. The United States mostly helped Israel to run those attacks. For example, the distance from, you can see where it is. Doesn't work, okay. It's like 1,000 miles between Israel and Iran. So Israel has American weapon systems like F-15, F-16. They are not heavy bombers. They are what you call fighter bombers. They have much shorter range, so they need to be refueled in the air. So Israel has very old, what you call a tanker. It's like a plane, like a passenger plane that was converted to be like a flying gas station. So Israel's tankers are very old, more than 50 years, and there are not enough of them. So the United States allowed Israel to refuel from American tankers that were sent to the areas. So the US gave all kinds of assistance, for example, also to intercept missiles that were fired from Iran to Israel. So the Americans deployed the THAAD missile. It's a missile that's supposed to intercept long-range missiles, and it was quite successful, at least according to current reports, because later on, sometimes something look like the results of the bombing, I can talk about that too, looks pretty good right now, and later on you might find out it wasn't so good. The same thing with the performance of weapon system. There is still a lot of what we call the fog of war and misinformation, and right now there isn't even enough information in some areas. It's important to mention that the THAAD is supposed to protect, including the US mainland and other areas where they are, or across the globe with their US forces, from incoming missiles. During this current war, the US fired like 20% of the missiles, the THAAD missiles that it had. So it was also very expensive, cost around $1 billion, but also the stockpile of those missiles ran a little low. So you have to increase the production for that in case there is another war. We always talk, It's not here in the map, of course, about Taiwan. If tomorrow or in the upcoming future, China will try to take Taiwan, maybe the United States will intervene, and then there will be maybe some limited confrontation between the United States and China, and then they will need those missiles to intercept the Chinese missiles, and China has a lot of them. Of course, the main danger is the war like with Russia or even China in the worst case scenario, or North Korea, that have nuclear missiles that can be carried by what we call ICBM. You might remember it from the Cold War. Those are long-range missiles that can reach the United States. So obviously you need as many missiles like the THAAD to intercept them, so the missiles, let alone with a nuclear warhead, will not hit the United States.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So with the stockpile being depleted, how long does it typically take to manufacture the replacements?
Well, it's a sophisticated missile, and it's not like you can overnight. It's not like a bullet of a gun that you just kind of mass production. And it's, of course, also a matter of priorities. They fired only 20%, so they have 80% left. So it's not like they ran out of ammunition. It's also important to mention here there was a campaign that, and they didn't talk about it a lot. This is the access to the Red Sea, the Suez Canal here. So this is a very important route for goods to go from the Far East, so East Asia, and other areas, and India, of course, from the Suez Canal to Europe and to the United States. And there are a pro-Iranian group in Yemen there, the Houthis. They, for years now, have been firing missiles and what you call drones, armed drones, against ships in that very, here it's a vital straits, they call it the Bab el-Mandab Straits. And basically because of that, many ships, instead of going from there, went across entire Africa, from all the way from the south, which of course increased the time, the expense of the voyage, and of course makes all their goods they carry much more expensive. The United States, during the Trump administration, just a few months ago, ran a campaign in Yemen, tried to stop it, but there were no US casualties that we know about, but the US lost some drones and also 2 fighters for accidents. The main problem that it cost a lot of money. So Trump, you can say, made a business decision, but also it made a lot of sense in that sense that it's too expensive and it's not worth it. And even then, there was also a problem that the Houthis tried to sink American ships with drones and missiles. So they fired drones that sometimes were very cheap to make. And the US had to intercept them in order to protect the American troops and sailors on the ships with very expensive missiles. Sometimes the missile that you shoot to intercept a drone costs the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's not worthwhile if after a while you can run out of missiles or spend a lot of money. So the US had to improvise, and they managed to do some all kinds of improvements, get some very cheap rockets to intercept those those drones. It is always a problem that if you use military force now, it's very expensive, especially for the US military that has all kinds of high-tech weapons that cost a lot, including, of course, the production, because it's always a matter of priorities. What you're going to produce, more missiles for defense or more missiles that you can attack with. So there is all kinds of reasons to do either of them, because sometimes if you have more missiles that you can shoot at the enemy, you can deter it or even prevent him from firing at you, but not always. So it's always a balance between them. Of course, if you have any more questions, it's not like I can continue to talk about all kinds of matters in this conflict, like those super bombs that they used to try to crack the Iranian sites. But if you have any question, please feel free to just ask me whenever, as I talk. Like those huge bombs, the Iranian had some of their main nuclear sites here. Some of them were inside the mountain, buried so deep, so the Israelis could not penetrate them with their bombs. Their bombs were not powerful enough. the US military, the US Air Force, had what they call the MOP. It's a giant bomb, that 30,000-pound explosive that they used eventually on June 22 to try to crack, to pave their way down the mountain in order to blow up the nuclear facility that were down the mountain. So, of course, it's all over the news how much it was successful. Still not clear, because there are satellite photos that took pictures of the site from above, but you don't know exactly what happened inside, because you don't have men on the ground that actually can go into the ruins, clear and say, okay, this part was destroyed, or all of it was destroyed. Nobody knows yet how much damage was inflicted to the Iranian nuclear sites. We know later, and also we will not know then how good are those bombs. That's one aspect. It's also, in a certain point here, another vital area called the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the oil in the world pass in those straits. So in a certain point in the current war, in the recent war, Iran threatened to block those straits with sea mines and missiles. They can do it quite easily. The US Navy prepared to break this siege, but it could have been costly because some of the Iranians could have fired missiles on the US Navy that, of course, will have escalated the war. It was prevented, but it's always a possibility that there are still talks right now talks between the US and Iran, unofficial or official, it's all kind of blur, if they can reach an agreement. If not, maybe the war, part of it, will be resumed, and then the Iranians might do that. It's not over yet. It's not like the war ended completely, and now there's going to be a negotiation for sure that will lead to an agreement. It could be a stalemate. It could be some kind of a vague situation in which it's not clear what the Iranians or the US or other parties might do. So it's still kind of blur. That's like the main things, but I would like to open it to questions if you have something that you want to ask specifically on each of the states, about what the US military can do, about economic aspects of the war, about more on the past if you want me to talk about each of the countries here. Whatever you want, you could try. Not politics. I'm not a political expert. So, yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity, back in, I think it was 2016, 2017, the administration chose to pull out of the Iranian monitoring deal where they would lift sanctions with the ability for the inspectors to go in. How much effect do you think that had on Iran's ability or encouraged Iran to go off and build its own nuclear weapons versus if they had lived up to the agreement, would their economic growth be better so they wouldn't pursue nuclear weapons?
Yeah, the Iranian nuclear program started in the 70s with the former regime. Later in the 80s, it was frozen. I'll just give a little bit of background here. It was frozen because the Ayatollah Khomeini, you all remember him from the 80s, as much as he wasn't against war, he basically ran an 8 years war against Iraq, and he didn't want to end it. Eventually, he was forced to do that. He said it was like drinking poison for him. So as radical and as violent as he could have been, and he didn't want nuclear weapons. There was even maybe some religious aspects there involved that prevented him from doing that. Until today, Iran claims that they have what they call a fatwa. It's like a religious rule that rules out, I wouldn't say how you call it, not a verdict, but something like that from the supreme leader. The supreme leader is the one who runs Iran, at least for now. And he said that Iran will never produce nuclear weapons because it's against Islam. So some say it's just a cover or not. Anyway, Iran has been working on producing nuclear weapons at least since the 90s. In 2003, they might have stopped, maybe following the US war in Iraq. They were afraid they might be next. So they kind of put it on hold. But they still were planning to do that. They just didn't try to actually produce a bomb. They went on with their nuclear program. In 2015, there was a major agreement between the Obama administration and Iran. They called the JCPOA. It's kind of a highly complicated agreement that kind of, to make it short, it prevented Iran from producing nuclear weapons or enough enriched uranium to produce such a weapon. So they kind of stopped them for a while. There were all kinds of restrictions there. And there was a huge debate if this agreement is the best the US can achieve or not. Trump at the time was against it, like many others. In 2018, he pulled out of the agreement. So because of that, Iran felt they have a free hand to enrich uranium. And when right now, when the war started, they had enough enriched uranium to produce 10 nuclear bombs. It doesn't mean they can tomorrow do that, especially now when Israel mostly and also the United States destroyed many of their facilities, their nuclear facilities. But before the war, they were weeks away for have enough material that can allow them to produce a bomb. Even then, they not just use the bomb, they needed, according to different estimation, from a few months to a year or two, to put this bomb on a missile that can be fired at Israel or some other state in the Middle East. So this agreement, the Iranians pulled out, so the Trump administration, pulled out in 2018, and because he thought that he will, what he called the maximum pressure, put economic pressure on Iran and force them to accept a better agreement than the one Obama achieved. Eventually, the Iranian economy has been struggling for years. It's kind of a tragedy because Iran has one of the biggest oil reserves in the world and also a lot of natural gas, highly educated people, and also other resources. But because of corruption, mismanagement, and also since they invest a lot of their money in supporting various groups all over the Middle East, Hezbollah, if you heard about them, and other terrorist organization, that they support them as part of what they call forward defense. They expect those groups that are Arab groups to fight for them. So they give them money to buy weapons and so on. And also they spent up to hundreds of, maybe billions of dollars on their nuclear program. So they gain a lot of money from their oil. They sell a lot to China. Right now, like 90% of the Iranian oil go to China. And for China, it's important, but it's only like 10% of the oil they import. So China can do without Iran, but not the opposite. So so in that sense, you can argue that if, like Trump said, he thought that he will be reelected in 2020 and increase the pressure and eventually force the Iranians to do what he wants. But it obviously did not work that way. And even now, you can debate if to put economic pressure on Iran can eventually force them to do what the United States wants, or they will just say, we are willing that our economy will even be almost completely destroyed, and our people will continue to, maybe not to starve, but clearly to suffer, and they do right now, as long as we can keep our nuclear program.
Well, look at North Korea.
Yeah, North Korea, yeah.
In terms of the number of millions, supposedly millions of people starve in order to support for the money that they have to go into the nuclear.
Yeah, it's like now there's in the news that Pakistan, it's another state, another example here, you can see part of it. It's a state north of India. They have like 200 million people. They are like Sunnis. They are not Arabs, but they are Sunnis. And they have nuclear weapons. They have a long conflict with India. And recently there was kind of a small war between them, but it did not become a nuclear war. India also has nuclear weapons. So that's, of course, very dangerous that two states that have nuclear weapons fight with each other. And only now there is a report that Pakistan is developing an ICBM, a long-range missile, that can carry nuclear warhead, with a range of like more than 4,000 miles, so it can reach the United States. So that's kind of a danger. Pakistan is not considered to be very radical, but there are radical elements there. So it's also something we want to keep your eye on. It could be the next crisis, because Pakistan also has severe internal problems, and it might even collapse maybe in the future. So you don't want a state that has nuclear weapons to collapse, because all kinds of terrorist organizations can get it. So this is another kind of another problem in this entire area, that it's all kind of messy and all that. Yes.
What role does religion play in all of this? Because you've mentioned it a couple times. You mentioned the Sunnis and the Shiites, and I know Iraq should have really been potentially three countries: a Sunni, a Shiite, and a
Kurds.
What's
The Kurds,
So what role does religion play in all of this?
Sometimes a lot. For some people, it's very important, but it's all the way you look at it. Even in Iraq, there are all kinds of factions inside Islam. For example, the Iraqis most of them are Shiites, but they are Arabs. And the Iranians, most of them are Shiites, but they are Persians. So there was during the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, Shiites from Iraq fought against their other Shiites in Iran, because they saw themselves as the Iraqis, because that's their state. Although Iraq is a pretty new state, you can see the borders there. In 2016, see the borders kind of, it's like someone just, like some, you could say even states in the US. Okay, let's make this, and this is like, so two officials from Britain and France decided to split the Middle East between then France and Britain were the big power. So okay, let's create this Iraq. There was no Iraq before that. So they kind of made Iraq and then made other states with their, according to their interest or whatever they felt will serve them right at the time. So Iraq, for example, has Kurds who are Muslims, but they are not Arabs. And most of them are Sunnis. And then you have Sunnis, and who are Arabs in Iraq. They are like 20%. Saddam Hussein was like that. He came from there. And when he was in power, the Sunnis were in power, and they suppressed the majority of the states who are Arabs, but Shiites. Now the Shiite Arab, because of the war with that the United States, the invasion, and the US took over, the US basically pushed aside the Sunnis and allowed the Shiites to take over. So now kind of the Shiites run the states more or less, but they have also different disagreements between them on all kinds of reasons: political, personal, economic, and so on. For example, there is a guy there. He is the most known religious leader there, El-Sassiani, if I pronounce him right. He's 94 years old. He's the highest authority in the Shiite world as far as ruling about religion. And he's kind of moderate in a way. He's against the United States, he's against Israel, but he doesn't want to fight them. He has this kind of a philosophy in the Shiite. There are different philosophies. One said you have to be more active, and the other said be more passive. And he said we have to be more passive and not active. While Iran wants to be more active, also because of all kinds of ideological reasons. But many times religion is just an excuse by Arabs, by the Iranians, and sometimes in Israel too, they use it as an excuse for political reasons, for economic, military, and so on. So it depends on which matter you talk about. But it's definitely important, but sometimes they can kind of bypass it or just give it like lip serving and just ignore it.
You touched on this just a little bit, but in your opinion, in the Middle East, what conflict should we be looking for? Like, we talked a little bit about Pakistan.
Yeah.
Down the road.
Down the road. Well, I can tell
Next
you.
week.
I can tell you, and in 10 minutes I will change my mind.
Yeah.
And
Well, just in your best, like
The best.
where they're simmering.
It depends. For the United States right now, they don't want the war with Iran to be resumed because it's if you want to make it short, bad for business. And the US doesn't want to be involved again in another war in the Middle East. It's like, of course, it's different because US, of course, was involved. You know, it's like, oh, where's the cost? Second. Well, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, as we know, the neighbors of Iran. So it still brings back all those demons from regime change and all that. With Iran, it will not be like that because in Iraq, the US conquered all of Iraq, and in Afghanistan, the same. Here, there will be no what you call boots on the ground. So at most, even if the war will be resumed and the US will be involved, it will be only airstrikes. That's it. There will be no conquer of Iran, which is also a huge state. It's like, you can see it's more than 600,000 square miles with 90 million people. So it's not something you want to conquer, and in that sense. The next conflict could be if the talks between the US and Iran collapse, maybe there will be another limited conflict between Israel and Iran, and the US could be involved more or less, depends on what President Trump will decide at that moment that it's good to do. And there are other conflicts, smaller ones that can happen, like in the West Bank, it's inside Israel. It doesn't really involve the United States directly. There is ongoing fight, not a major fight, but still it's going in the Gaza Strip. Trump said in the past that he wants to take over the Gaza Strip, then make it into a Riviera and all that, and to make it a great place. Right now, it's still like almost the entire Gaza Strip is in shambles, and there are still fights there between the Israeli military and the Hamas terrorist group. So in Pakistan, also we can keep our eye on it. Who knows what's going to be there? Right now, it's kind of under control, if you can say, but there is no like major conflict that you can see in the Middle East, at least that I can see in the upcoming months or something like that. In the past, it was much more dangerous in a way that there were two superpowers there, the Soviet Union and the United States involved. Like in 1973, during the war between Israel and Egypt, the United States went into what called like DEFCON 3, I think, increased their alert, and they came close to have some kind of a conflict with the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was about to send troops to fight against the Israelis in the Middle East. So the US, because of all kinds of calculations, could not afford that. So there could have been a war that could have escalated into a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Middle East in the past. It's all over now because Russia doesn't have this kind of power anymore. Putin wants to be like Putin, the president of Russia, wants to restore the glory of the Soviet Union, but not in the Middle East. Russia used to still have actually, two bases in Syria, an airfield and a harbor there, but they might lose that too. So they don't have much presence in the Middle East. At least we always have to remember that because many of you lived during the Cold War. There was always a situation that might escalate, in Berlin, for example, in Europe mostly, but even in other areas like, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that, 1962. It doesn't exist anymore in the Middle East. In the Ukraine, there was in the past and still is maybe a possibility that if the US will be dragged into the fight, it will be a direct fight with Russia. In Russia, it's pretty weak, and also our economy is in bad shape because of the war. But Russia still has those ICBM, and if there is a war with Russia, and tomorrow or whenever, because of whatever reason, they can fire their missiles at the United States. And they basically can decimate the United States. And the United States tried to develop, now Trump tries to improve it, some kind of a defense that will intercept those Russian missiles or in the future Chinese missiles. But right now there isn't, let alone a perfect air defense that can protect the US mainland if China or Russia or both fire their missiles at the United States. And those missiles from Russia can reach here in less than an hour. So that's like doomsday scenario that in the Cold War, it was much more common. Now it seems like some kind of a bad memory from the past. but it can still happen. So we always have to bear in mind this kind of a risk to the United States and to try to prevent it. Even China has been improving and increasing her nuclear arsenal. In the past, China didn't have many nuclear weapons. Now they want to have more. So gradually, China could be, it's all part of the rivalry with the United States. So the US has to prepare itself not only against Russia, but mostly against China, which has also other aspects, economic ones and so on. But this is also a matter to remember that nuclear war is still a possibility. We probably still remember the movie The Day After from 1983. You can still watch it on YouTube. It's a pretty good movie. I watch it every couple of years. It gives you some kind of a reminder what could happen. Of course, you don't have to be like afraid every day that this World War III is coming, but just remember it's still out there somewhere.
So we're in this long game of destabilization, you say here.
Yeah.
So, for instance, so the military in that case, for all these different scenarios, the military is always preparing for some scenario. I assume, I read or someone said that the bombing that just took place on Iraq was very well timed and very well planned and had been planned for several years.
Yes.
So it didn't happen overnight.
Yeah, of
So
course.
presumably the military is always planning. You just have to wonder what the military intelligence is that they're getting and how it translates into, you don't want to discuss the political side of it, but how much weight does the military intelligence have? Oh, God help us. With the current
Well, the military has, what they call sometimes contingency plan for all kinds of scenarios, even completely unlikely, some of them all over the globe. So even during the Obama administration, they had that bomb. And there was a possibility that even then he talked about that if his talks with Iran will fail, he might have to use that giant bomb against Iran. So even then there were plans. And this, by the way, this huge bomb was never tested in combat until now. So it worked. Yeah, it worked. Well, we know it blew up. So it was like a nuclear weapon. And in test, they did test in Arizona. It worked pretty well. But in actual combat against an actual target, it's also good after that for business if you want to sell it to someone. But after that's beside always sometimes you use wars in order to test new weapons, and then it could be like it's a good like after that you can make a very nice video to sell it to states across the globe. That's always, you have to remember that part of the deal. But yes, the military has all kinds of plans for all kinds, and there are many kinds of like intelligence agency in the US, like I think around 16. You got even the Coast Guard have them. So it's like eventually there is a group, the National Intelligence, how do you call it, Directory, that they kind of take the intelligence assessments for everyone, and they kind of form it into one. And once a year, they give a report to Congress. And of course, they talk with the president all the time. They give him daily briefings so he will know what's going on. Besides that, is also, of course, the CIA and there's the State Department. Each one have their own evaluation. And it depends, of course, in DC, how much political power they have, capital they have in order to push their agenda. And there are all kinds of power struggles because some of, like, especially now, the Republicans are usually, they're even inside what you call the mega movement. There are those who are totally against any US involvement in wars outside the United States. So it's a lot of politics is involved in that.
Are regime changes always beneficial? And I say this because when we got rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, there were comments that, gee, now we have to deal with multiple factions versus dealing with one. We've seen the regime change in Syria, which I think still has to play out. But I believe in Afghanistan, we went in there, changed the government, and the day we pulled out, it all went back to the way it was.
Yeah, it's always very tricky. Sometimes it works. You can say the best example to do that, Japan and Germany after World War II. You took Japan, in World War II, before they surrendered, they were about to fight to the death, literally. And they trained their population to fight everyone, to fight the American invaders as they saw it. And there were estimation the US can lose up to 1 million troops if they invade the mainland and fight all the way to Tokyo and all that. It was avoided. And like the Japanese, 1 minute they were willing to fight to the death. The next, nothing. There was no insurgent, there were no rebels, there was no mutiny in Japan. After they surrendered, okay, that's it. And then the US was there, MacArthur, if we all remember, and then they kind of accepted the Western way of life, and that was a great example for regime change. And Japan, until today, they are a democracy. According to their own constitution, they cannot even attack another country, but now they might try to change it because of China. So that was a good example from the past. They thought they could do that in Iraq. There was a potential, and there still is in Iraq, when they went there in 2003, because they have a lot of educated people there, and they have the resources, the oil and all that, that can help them to restore the country. But of course, it all fell apart from all kinds of reasons, and it's always a gamble. As far as the Iranian regime, I think, to my personal opinion, is that it could not get, yes, of course, it could always be worse, but this one is just eager to exploit the people of his own country and use the money, all the money they gain from oil and all that, to destabilize the Middle East, attack Americans and their allies and all that. They are pretty bad. So even if they are gone and you don't know who will replace them, as far as many, it's better than the current one. In other cases, with Assad, he was already quite weak, like in Syria, the Assad in Syria, he was very weak. So it didn't make much of a difference. He wasn't as powerful as he used to be before the civil war. But yes, regime change is always a gamble. And of course, the United States officially many times don't want to support it because it's kind of a political dynamite, especially after the grim experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah.
Yes. So why did Israel do this? In other words, okay, they gathered this intelligence and then they just took it upon themselves to say, we need to eradicate their nuclear weapons because the US isn't doing anything. You could say the same about North Korea. You know, right now, somebody in the world could say, oh my gosh, they're starting to really get close, and you know, and go after there. So
North Korea has achieved it.
Yeah,
so it's not they couldn't get close.
Why did, you know, what was it about Israel that they hated Iran, maybe some background, you know, they've got their own war with Gaza going on, why in the world would they just add this to, that's something that I haven't been able to understand, and because there are other places, like you said, India and Pakistan, they have nuclear weapons too. Why are we not afraid, you know, is Iran so awful of a regime and they're so bloodthirsty to go expand their territory and destabilize the Middle East? You know, is that the reason? And you could say the same about North Korea wanting to, you know, maybe take over South Korea, or what is it that, you know, I'm just trying to understand, what is it that Israel felt so strongly and got, I mean, we certainly would have had the same intelligence and we didn't attack, you know. I don't know, just thoughts on that.
Well, it's like differences in the approach. For Israel, Iran is a threat to their own survival. For the United States, in the worst case, it will be like North Korea in the Middle East. And they say, okay, North Korea already has nuclear weapons, and they kind of managed to contain and handle North Korea, and they have, of course, much bigger enemies, Russia and China, that already has nuclear weapons, so it's like we can deal with it. But Israel decided they are not going to tolerate that. In the past, like in 2007, Israel found out that Syria has a nuclear reactor and about to produce nuclear weapons. So the Prime Minister of Israel went to then George Bush, the president, and said, are you going to do something about it? And George Bush then, after Iraq and all that, said, maybe we'll try some kind of diplomatic pressure. He said, I'm not going to use force. But he said, it's like in the Sopranos, he told the Israeli Prime Minister, do what you have to do. You know, that's in the mobs, kind of like, do what you have to do. So the Israelis understood this is kind of a green light, and they bombed and destroyed that nuclear reactor. That was relatively simple. There was one nuclear reactor, they took it out, and also after that, they didn't say they did it. It's like Something happened, we don't know. It took years, and the Israelis usually like to brag about almost everything. I know that from personal experience, but in this case, nothing. They were quiet. That like in the Assad, he lost his nuclear reactor, and he also pretended he didn't want to admit he has a nuclear reactor. So he didn't admit that he lost something that he didn't want to say that he had, and the Israelis didn't admit they bombed something that everyone knew they did. So it was kind of like very phony, but they managed to get away with it. In Iran, it's much more complicated. First, they have many sites, not one, so you cannot just destroy one site and get it over with. And Iran and Israel has a conflict. Iran, of course, sees Israel as its nemesis. For them, Israel is the small Satan, and the US is the big Satan. So for the Israelis, although they are only the small one, it's still good enough for them to try to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. So there will be books written about that, how much coordination was between the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Trump. How much he said to him, look, we are going to start it. We have to do it because we think Iran is about to produce nuclear weapons. For us, it's unacceptable. We cannot allow it. So maybe they're not as close as we think, but they are close enough. It's now or never for us. And then they said, we hope that the United States will join us, at least later. And it did. So it was a gamble by the Israel that proved itself. And Trump might have said, okay, let the Israelis start alone. I will give them just kind of military aid, help them to intercept the missiles that Iran will fire at Israel, some kind of like defensive, to be around the defensive. I'm not going to attack Iran. Later on, when Israel was successful and he saw that Israel is managed to gain important achievements, he said, okay, I'm going to join the party, and he bombed that place. And even then, after that, he used it in order to end the war very quickly. So he didn't want to use it in order to bomb other places in Iran, because he was afraid, of course, on the oil. If he starts going after the oil prices will go up, and as I say, it's bad for business. And also Iran, that's another factor. There are, across there, you see here the Persian Gulf. So Iran has here, and here there is the Saudi and others oil facilities and natural gas and American bases. So for Iran, it was pretty easy to attack those bases with rockets and missiles and other ways, and also with maybe sleeper cells, and even maybe in the United States, there were even reports that they had cyber capability that can disrupt the grid across the United States. So it was a risk. So in that sense, Trump wasn't probably sure he's going to do it, but at a certain point he did. So it was like for Israel now or never, even if it was maybe they underestimate how much the Iranians are close to have the ability to produce nuclear weapon, but they say we still have to do it. And in North Korea, it's already, as you said, it's kind of too late because they already have nuclear weapons. From time to time, in order to aggravate their neighbors, they fire missiles over Japan, who really doesn't like it. And they even possibility, they have nuclear missiles with a range, maybe they cannot reach all over the US mainland, but they can reach the West Coast with a nuclear weapon. So if you go after them, of course, who knows what they're going to do, but you have to stop them before if you go after North Korea, you have to make sure that they cannot hit California or something like that.
Just a quick clarification. You said earlier we lost 20% of our missiles in the Iranian attack?
Invested. 20% of the missiles were fired, by the US military. US forces that are deployed inside Israel use their own missiles to intercept Iranian missiles. So on one hand, you said we use 20% of the missiles in order to protect an ally, not US forces. But on the other hand, you can say that we tested that the missile was never tested in combat. There's always other side of the equation that in this sense, you use those missiles and okay, if they are good, they're great. And if they're not good, then the Iranian missiles will not hit the US population with the Israeli population. So it's bad, but you kind of test it outside the United States. So there's always all kinds of aspects, economic ones and political ones, ideological. So if someone tells you something, you can be pretty sure there's also an argument against it. So you always have to know before you decide, I always suggest,
The whole truth.
yeah, the whole truth, yeah, all the other,
Why not use those, against Russia and Ukraine? Why not help Ukraine and do the same thing against the Russian missile?
for the same reason, money, for all kinds. First of all, the US does give money and weapons to Ukraine. And like Patriot missiles and other air defense capabilities to shoot down all those drones and missiles the Russians are firing at Ukraine. With Ukraine, Trump tried to end the war, but Putin insists on his terms, so probably it will not happen. And there it's very much more risky, because here you only deal with Iran. There, Russia already changed their doctrine, in which they say that if a country helps Ukraine to attack Russia with conventional weapon, then Russia keeps the right to attack the other country with nuclear weapon. So they kind of escalate, they make it for them, much easier to use nuclear weapons. And if, of course, Russia will use even what you call tactical nuclear weapon, which is a small one, in Ukraine, it can escalate very quickly to a global nuclear war with Russia. And we just said, you don't want those hundreds of missiles with nuclear warheads from Russia reaching here, then like in half an hour and all that, and then, it could destroy the country. So it's very risky in Ukraine. You always bear in mind how much you want to help Ukraine in order to prevent a World War III, but also not to get dragged into a war like that. Yeah. Yeah.
The one thing I want to add, looking at the map, I'm not going to get political, but the fact that Israel, size of New Jersey, population of 9 million, still exists, is miraculous to me.
It's
really, you just look at
it's a little spot.
9 million people, and we live in
Yes, for Iran, you see how much bigger.
the land mass around it.
You can see the sizes. Iran is much bigger than Israel. Has 90 million people. In Israel, there are like 9 million, and has much more oil and gas. But here, because of combination of the Israeli capabilities and also U.S. support, all this, like a lot of the U.S. gives Israel a lot of military and diplomatic support. So it's a combination of that, while Iran was basically alone. Iran has some kind of an alliance, or at least relations with China and Russia. But they did not get involved in this fight, did not even say much, because they rather have business with the United States, with all the rivalry with them, than support Iran. And what Iran did also, Iran could have disrupted the flow of oil from the Gulf, which is very bad for China. So Iran was kind of alone in this fight. While with Russia, if you fight Russia directly, it's a whole new different ballgame. But yes, Israel, the fact that Israel managed to handle all those fights, it's sometimes basically a miracle. It is. It is, because they manage here. They have a very good air force. Of course, all the aircraft are made in the United States, but Israel has a pretty advanced military industry, so they add all kinds of improvements, and they could be very bold. Like many times, the Americans can be also very bold in their operation, but the Israelis can take all kinds of risks the Americans might not, because they're kind of like, I like to call it like cowboys of the Middle East. So it's like, sometimes it's just like, okay, let's try it, see what happens, and find all kinds of solutions outside the box, even if nobody tested them before. Yeah.
One quick question. You said Iran wants to be a dominant force or player in the Middle East. Based on what? I can't think of any things that I...
History and, more important, ego.
Pardon me?
Ego. They just think they are better. They think they are better than others. Iran...
But so why do you feel that way?
No, it's like they feel like that.
How do we know how they feel? I don't
because, for example, from time to time, they kind of admit, one of the officials say, they have all kinds of proxies and partners across the Middle East, and they say, some of them say, either we have a presence or we control those states, like in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and all that. Sometimes one of them kind of is not very careful, not very diplomatic, and kind of say that they are depends how you call it, control or have influence in the Middle East. They want to be the dominant power. They might allow the Arab states to exist and not make them have Iranian rulers, but they want to kind of let them know who's the boss. It's always like that in the Middle East. In the past, it was Turkey. Even now, they want to, some say in the north, Turkey, of course, they are not Persians, they are not Arabs, but they used to use the Ottoman Empire. For 400 years, they ruled most of that area. And each country here, it's like in Europe in the past, had their golden age, at least in their own eyes, that they want to expand, like Syria and even Egypt. Egypt still sees itself as the leader of the Arab world. They have like 100 million people. They always say, we are the real states, all the others are just tribes with flags. That's how they see their own Arab neighbors. So they all kind of look down on each other, all those big states. So now Iran says, now it's our turn. Yeah.
Is it really safe to travel? I mean, it kind of makes me.
If you like adventures.
I traveled in Turkey and felt very safe.
No, Turkey, yes.
Because their tourism is a big
definitely.
employer for them.
Yeah, of course.
So they know they have to keep that under wraps so nobody gets,
Of course, yeah.
injured. Egypt, interestingly enough, was okay to travel to until everyone got killed in '78 or whatever, that big massacre that happened.
Yeah, there was.
So that was the intent, was to disrupt, people visiting, and they were successful in that effort. So, Saudi Arabia is trying to be a travel destination, and how safe is it there? It just makes me.
Right, it could be pretty safe. Many of those states, like in Egypt, could be pretty safe. In Sinai, you can say, this is, let's see, I can point. Okay, there was this little, here, Sinai Peninsula. There used to be terror attacks against tourists, but much less right now. So it's relatively safe. In the rest of Egypt, also relatively safe. And it's like, you can go to other places. Saudi Arabia, it's not much of a tourism attraction right now, but they want to be. Turkey, of course, could be pretty safe, especially even Israeli and Jews go there. Other states, of course, it's like, even Jordan you can go, and of course to Israel, it's pretty safe. It all depends where. It's like, even in the United States, there are some bad neighborhoods. You will not want to go at night and say, I'm all alone, come to get me. So it's like there are some other areas that Lebanon used to be a major tourism attraction, now less because of the instability there. While in Syria, if you go, I recommend a very good medical insurance if you go to Syria as a tourist right now. Maybe later. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. You live in Clinton?
Yeah.
Are you a professor at a college?
No, I'm kind of independent. I don't like, my subject, Israel's national security, is not very common exactly in the universities. They teach other aspects. So I just give lectures here and there. I wrote like 9 books in English, 2 in Hebrew. I can give you my card if you want, I can send you. So I just live here. I'm a US citizen and all that. I've been living with my girlfriend in Clinton for years now. And love it here. It's a very peaceful, great place to live.
Clinton, a political hotbed.
Yeah. Well, very kind of a center for.
Political hotbed?
Yeah.
Making a joke.
Yeah, it's like, you can be here, today even in this world, you can either give lecture. I give lecture by Zoom also. In interviews, commentary, I give some, like the Wall Street 2 weeks ago, they asked me something. So in today's world, you don't necessarily have to be on the spot. You can just talk with people by Zooms, WhatsApp, name it by that. And sit in your nice house and just try to take care of your dogs and all that, or something like that.
Where did your op-ed appear?
This is a magazine in Israel that also is published in English. I published in several places because.
If you publish it locally, we could use the information.
Sure, I'll be happy to.
I can't do it for you.
Yes, if you want, I can send you, like, I'm working on a website. After that, it's still not finished. It's like my girlfriend, who's my technical support, she's working on that. So when it's finished, you can go there and see the sites, what you like, yeah. It's like, thank you very much for coming, and I'm happy to give another. Thank you.